Welcome to the Cowboy Up Podcast, where talk is all about the West. This episode is brought to you by White Stallion Ranch and produced by Cowboy Spirit USA. The West of yesteryear is filled with colorful characters who continue to fascinate and intrigue us. At least a half dozen of those individuals were making history during the summer of 1876. Historian Chris Wimmer joins Russell and Allen to talk about what we know of that very pivotal time.
Morning, Alan. It's
Another
always
hot day here in lovely Tucson.
yeah, it is hot. We were in Benson yesterday looking at horses, and it's not quite as hot where we were, and it was still hot. And they were all talking about the horror that is Tucson, and I'm sitting there thinking, no, that's Phoenix. Tucson's not that bad, but it's a little warm. But good day. Western history's one of our favorite topics, and that's what we're doing today.
Well, I love Western history, so any part of it makes me happy.
Is there anybody who sort of stands out as your favorite character?
Cochise.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just
no kidding.
He was so central to what happened here in Arizona and in both sides of the border, and both with the Hispanics and the whites, and then the Indians, and was just a player on all fronts, and a really bright guy.
You know what? I wouldn't have been quick enough with that answer, but I would agree 100%. I'm fascinated by that person who we're not going to talk about today, I don't think. But it's hard not to think about Wyatt Earp, Jesse James. I mean, we're going to talk about 7 different people today, and we've got a great premise of a book, and it's the summer of 1876, Outlaws, Lawmen, and Legends in the Season That Defined the American West. And, of course, Chris Wimmer, the author, is with us today. He's also the creator, host, and lead writer of Legends of the Old West, the podcast that tells true stories of the American West. Master's degree in journalism from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at that university they have up somewhere near Phoenix. And what's that called again?
I forget. Yeah. On purpose.
Arizona State University, which is really painfully, I have to say, coming on as a great American university. Chris has won numerous local, state, and national awards for his writing. This book, The Summer of 1876, is his first book, and we're really excited to have you. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate being here. I'm trying to catalog everything that I need to rebut very quickly.
Well, we'll try not to attack. We're just interested in kicking it around, and what I would have to say is you picked an exact time on the title of the book that so many things happened here in the West. The train came through, and the settlers arrived in big numbers, and just a lot was happening then. So that's just a fascinating time.
Yeah, it was an incredible time period. And luckily or unluckily, I actually am in Phoenix right now. So I am right in the middle of the horror you were just talking about with all of the heat. It's pretty gross right now. And yeah, I guess maybe luckily for the Arizona State versus University of Arizona debate, I don't have a dog in the fight necessarily. Since I was born and raised in Iowa, my fight is with Iowa Cyclones fans. I went to the University of Iowa, so we have our natural rivalry there. But it was fun to go spend a year at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, and that helped inform the way I write the podcast and probably a little bit about the book. And then I wish I could dredge up the series that we did on the Apache Wars to remember all the details of the Cochise story. That would be a fantastic one to talk about. But unfortunately, I wrote that so long ago that most of the details escape me at this point. Maybe for the next interview.
Well, we'll just have to come back to it. So how did, what led you to the idea that the summer of 1876 was a seminal period? What What took you to that?
It was really the podcast work that when I decided I wanted to start a podcast dedicated to telling the true stories of the Old West era, which I, like many people, had seen lots of versions of on film and TV. And I started thinking, well, I wonder how close the movie and TV versions are to the true story. And you always hear the old adage that either truth is stranger than fiction or truth is better than fiction, however you want to phrase it. And I thought, well, yeah, I want to see what the true stories of the movie Tombstone is, for example. Let's stick with an Arizona-based story. Most people have seen that. It was certainly a family favorite for us. But I realized I'd never really read in depth about the real story of the gunfight at the OK Corral and lots of the true stories that I grew up watching movies about. So I started the podcast to try to tell those true stories. And it was in doing the research for the different podcast series that I started to realize, wow, lots of these things happened in a really short space of time. And it really just hit me as an epiphany that some of the most well-known figures of the Old West era did the thing or had the thing done to them, I guess, that they are most well known for in about a 90-day space of time. From mid-June to mid-September in 1876 is when lots of these huge things happened that involve a lot of the most well-known figures of the Old West. And so I thought, man, I don't think I've ever read a book that puts them all into context and shows how all those stories overlapped with each other. Maybe that would be a fun book project. And I was lucky to be able to go through the process to pitch it to a very well-known publisher, and they said yes, thank God, and then I was able to write the book, and so here it is.
Do you think that any of the individuals, the 7 individuals that you write about, were aware that was such a pivotal date right then, that they were in the middle of a time that our world was changing to such a degree?
Probably on a ground level, no, I think would probably be the answer. I think the people who were involved in maybe the Native American campaign or the U.S. Army campaign against the tribes of the Northern Plains probably had a sense of the closest sense to that size of enormity and change, that the whole goal of that campaign was to drive the tribes of the Northern Plains onto reservations to fully open the West to expansion and to, of course, take the gold that was in the Black Hills. And so I think they might have had some sense of it, but I think everybody else was operating in their own little bubble, in their own little world, and probably didn't have an understanding of how all the different pieces connected in real time. So it was more left to historians to look back with hindsight and think, man, that was a crazy time period.
Yeah, your preface says that. It sort of holds that one out. The Little Bighorn is the one that people were aware of its impact at the time. And
yeah, that was certainly in the moment, that was the most consequential, just with the loss of this, who at the time, in his own time, George Armstrong Custer was an American hero and an American icon in his own time. And to have him lost to, as most people would think, it was literally overnight. He was here one day and gone the next. But the shock of that event, the loss of Custer and his command at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, was so huge to most people that it was really hard to understand and hard to fathom. So certainly people understood the enormity of that when it happened. And I think some had an idea of the sense of size of the campaign itself and what could be if it went the way the U.S. Army hoped.
What when that I try to picture myself at that time, and all that happened with Custer and all that, was the average citizen then just incensed with that, and did they just everybody rise up and say, we've got to make an end to this, now just kill the bad guys and go on down the road? Those damn Indians have caused enough problem and it's time for them to go away. Was that the sense of a lot of people, or
I get the sense that it probably was a predominant feeling, and it's hard to paint with a broad brush, but I think a lot of people simply didn't care what happened to the Native American societies out west. Most people's priority was simply open up the land for white settlement, and whatever happens to the Native American societies happens. If they move on to reservations, fine. If they die in the process of expansion, that's fine too. I think most people didn't really care one way or another. Some people did actively believe that the Native Americans needed to be killed, and that was the best way to deal with the situation. So there was that extreme violent end to it. But then certainly after Custer was killed, I would imagine that the fervor rose, and you can see some of that in the newspaper headlines from across the country, and the way some of those articles are written. They use language that we obviously would never use today, and there's a lot of vitriol in those articles. And that's part of the reason I started one of my chapters with a series of headlines from newspapers around the country, so you can get the reader who reads the book can get a sense of what newspaper writers were throwing out there into the world right after it happened. And so I gave a little taste of that in the book.
So, in a sense, summary of those headlines was kill the bad guys and they have red skins, or was
Yeah, some of it. I mean, the initial headlines were more just the shock of what they usually called some version of the Custer massacre. The initial reaction was, my God, there has been a massacre out west. Custer is dead. And then as time goes on and as you get deeper into the subheadings, you'll find a little more of the attack-minded or retaliatory headlines or subheads in there. I think one of them said something like, don't quote me on this, but I think this is very close. One of the subheadings in one of the articles said, "Sitting Bull, not your treaty-making Indian." Something like that. Like, it's not a direct reference to he's a terrible guy, but it's an indirect reference to clearly he's not going to make peace. He's just going to kill whoever's around him. And I think probably the implication is, therefore, we need to hunt him down.
Of course, didn't he end up in the Buffalo Bill show ultimately?
Yeah, very briefly. He did.
Yeah.
He did participate in Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, I think, for about a year late in his life.
And I think what I've read about Bill Cody is that a lot of the prominent Indians of the time respected him because he was a warrior and a straight shooter. But George Custer, what I've read about him is his wife did kind of spend a lot of, or maybe most of the rest of her life working on polishing or rehabbing his image after he died. How do you see him? I mean, he's been portrayed as just a crazy wild man who created his own problem, a courageous guy. As a little boy, I for whatever reason, I thought Custer was pretty much a big hero. Of course, that was just a little boy's ignorance. But how do you put Custer?
Yeah, I think you're right on both of those cases, that Libby Custer did spend basically the rest of her life rehabbing her husband's image to the extent that she felt it needed to be. The fact that people were starting to criticize him at some point after the battle, she devoted most of the rest of her life to making sure that he was held up as essentially a martyr and an American hero who was killed by the bad guys, as you referenced earlier. But Custer is a complicated guy because from all the accounts I've read, he definitely had that flamboyant and arrogant side to him. I think all the stories you read seem to support the idea that he was willing to charge out in front of his fellow soldiers. He was willing to take risks that he shouldn't have taken. And he had this very much of a devil may care attitude. And he was one of those guys that just kind of got lucky with that. He had this crazy, kind of no holds barred attitude, but it ended up working out for him so many times in the past that by the time he got to the summer of 1876, he believed his own hype to an extent that he thought he could almost do anything.
He was invincible.
It was almost an invincibility, though I do want to be cautious in saying, when you read the book, I don't know if I hope that I wrote it clearly enough. It's always hard to tell when you're that deep into it, but there's two sides to the Battle of Little Bighorn. There's absolutely Custer's side where you can see his arrogant persona and he wants to charge and attack and he wants to win at all costs. He doesn't care how badly he's outnumbered. This strategy has always worked for him in the past, even if he got very lucky with it. And it wasn't necessarily because of his boldness or his strategic genius. It was much more luck than it was anything on his side, he was still going to try to employ the same tactics he always did. But at the same time that half of the story existed, there was also the half of the story where at a certain point during the immediate lead up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, like in the 24 hours before the battle, he found himself at a crossroads where he was almost positive that his command had been discovered. And if it had not already been discovered by the Lakota and Cheyenne, it would be imminently. So he only had two choices, and that's where his arrogant side comes in. His two choices were he could have retreated from the area. He had a really good sense of where the Native American village was. He could have retreated. He could have spent time regrouping and reorganizing with the other army columns in the area for the big coordinated attack that was supposed to happen. Or he could have charged into the fray and just attacked on his own and tried to capture all the glory for himself, which is, of course, what he did.
How about the other commanders? Do they deserve the missing guys, the other columns? Do they deserve blame?
I guess if you were to throw around the word blame, maybe George Crook's Wyoming column was, I've always been a little skeptical about what was going on with him. His column fought in the Battle of the Rosebud a week before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, but he made no effort to communicate what happened in that battle to the other commanders who were in the field. He retreated down into Wyoming and just regrouped and sat there and waited for reinforcements. And I feel like he probably could have done a lot more to help out the overall campaign and the other commanders.
I didn't even know about him. But how about, what was it, Benteen, and what was the other one?
Yeah, in the actual battle itself, Major Marcus Reno leads one group of soldiers and Captain Frederick Benteen leads another. And I think of those two, Benteen is usually the one who is held up in high esteem as having been a good leader during the battle. And Reno is usually the one who was put down as being a pretty poor leader during the battle. And luckily for Reno, Benteen came to his aid and was able to help save their combined commands. But they're a mixed bag between the two of them.
One of the things that I was not confused but astounded by is the battle wasn't in one spot, but it was scattered all over a pretty big area, and had a hot spot here and another one there, and a mile away there was another group of soldiers, and the big portion of the soldiers were really scattered, not in one force. Is that not correct?
That is correct. It is a big area, and I would highly recommend to anyone who hears this, please go up to the Little Bighorn battlefield and see it for yourself. It is extraordinary. To actually be on the ground and see it for yourself. See how the soldiers were scattered. The monument, the whole area, has done a great job of placing tombstones roughly where the soldiers' bodies were discovered. So you can track the movements of the soldiers by their tombstones.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's incredible to see it. You can stand on Reno Hill and see how it all works. So, yeah, it was a running gunfight across about a 4-mile area, with the two hot spots being the last stand where Custer's command was killed, and then Reno Hill where Reno and Benteen's men now fought a siege war.
And so the other side, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, they're big part of your book. Is that?
Yeah, I tried to put as much detail as I could about them. I think anyone who loves this era of history, I think we would all want more information about the Native American side of the story. Unfortunately, it just didn't keep written records. Everything's passed down through oral tradition. So you try to get as much information as you possibly can. And I always want more about what was going on in the Native American camp and how did it all play out. And even with the great oral histories that have been passed down, it's still hard to know for sure. But what we do think we know about how the battle played out, both Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were instrumental in the defense of the camp and then the attack of the different groups of soldiers as the battle started to break up into 3 or 4 smaller battles. And Crazy Horse helped lead one of the advances, and Sitting Bull came along with reinforcements, and Crazy Horse helped attack some of the wings of Custer's command. It was really madness there for a couple hours.
Well, tell me I'm wrong, but didn't I read that the combined forces of the Indians were like 5,000 in number, but scattered, over a large area, but altogether a huge number?
Yeah, the numbers are always going to vary, but I think there's two numbers to keep in mind. One is the overall size of the village, which includes the older men and women and children, which is estimated somewhere around 8,000 total people. And then the number of warriors has always been estimated around 2,000, I think is the good number. That is probably the maximum number of men of fighting age would be considered warriors. And then how many of those actually participated in the battle? You can find estimates of anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000.
And how many cavalry?
Gosh, I think, you put me on the spot. I think Custer, before he broke up his command into all its different wings and factions, it was between, I'm going to just give you an estimate. I feel bad about it. I wish I had an exact number. There is an exact number, but it's somewhere between 400 and 600, right. Somewhere in that area. And then each group kept getting smaller. Like the quick example I can throw out is that the first action that happened in the overall Battle of the Little Bighorn was Major Marcus Reno leading 175 men toward the Native American village, having no idea how big it was and how many warriors were there. He's out there with 175 guys.
Attacking several thousand.
Yeah, eventually. Knowing his initial idea was that he was chasing a small group of about 50 warriors who had been at a small camp outside of the main camp. He was chasing them back toward the village to try to stop them from alerting the larger village. But of course, they made it to the village and all the warriors started swarming out of the village. And so now Reno's out on this flat plain with, by the time he starts firing, he has about 150 guys lined up in a row, firing at hundreds of warriors who were swarming out of the village and more who were coming behind them. And that's when he realized he was in real serious trouble. So
one of the things that it's part of the premise of your book, right? Is this such a convergence of things? And one thing that always, of course, I'm a dude rancher. The Eatons started their initially cattle and horse ranch in the 1880s. I think it was around 1886. I could be wrong about that. But they called it the Custer Trail Ranch because either the trail on the way to the Bighorn went through it or they camped on the way to the Bighorn. Either way, depends what story you read, but it was clearly named for that. And dude ranching started in that spot in 1892. So you think about it, it's not very far removed from the actual Battle of the Little Bighorn. Dude ranching gets started in the Dakota Territory. But one of the things you talk about is the inaugural baseball season of the National League.
Yeah, well, just to piggyback off your idea there, I certainly don't know the history of the dude ranches you're talking about. I would never want to speak expertly about that. But what was happening, certainly at the time that ranch was forming, there were still remains of soldiers being found for years after the battle. So while that ranch was being formed, almost certainly, if you want a little overlap, there still would have been soldiers' bodies being discovered in the brush and in various isolated places on the battlefield. It happened for a long time after the battle. So there would be a little bit of overlap there.
Wow.
Yeah. And so if they're up in that same area, who knows? Maybe some of the people who worked in the early stages of that ranch might have discovered the remains of soldiers who were not buried initially when the U.S. Army tried to, place all the remains and mark them with graves. But so as far as the baseball season, the inaugural season of the National League, that's a fun one. It's a small side story, related to the much larger events, but it was the first season of the National League. And part of the reason I really wanted to include it was that I think it's one of the few things that still exists. It's essentially living history. The National League still exists. We still watch it today, and it traces its roots back to this time period. So I think it's fun to put some of those highlights in there and show people how the baseball players they're watching today, how they started. And the example that I always throw out there is that, of course, because it was the first season, everything was a first. The first home run in National League history, the first strikeout, the first stolen base, all of those things would have happened. But none of them, of course, made too much news because they had been happening in all the other leagues. And now there was just the first time it had happened in the professional baseball league that ended up standing the test of time and stayed around. But the one thing that there were a couple things of note. The biggest one is that in mid-July, while the aftermath of the Little Bighorn is setting in, and Jesse James has just robbed another train and is trying to figure out his next move and is on the run from various posses in Missouri. That at that time frame in mid-July is when the first no-hitter happens. and of course,
hard to put those in the same thought process.
Yeah, like if you're a newspaper reader in St. Louis or anywhere in Missouri, your head must have been spinning, because the first 2 weeks of July, all the newspapers are dominated by the Little Bighorn and the follow-ups of the aftermath. And then Jesse James robs a train in early July, and he's on the run, and his gang is starting to experience heat for the first time that it's never felt before. And then in St. Louis, the pitcher throws a no-hitter for the first time. But, of course, they didn't have the term no-hitter. So it's interesting to read the newspaper article that details the first time that a no-hitter was thrown without the term. And they spend like 2 sentences trying to explain to the reader what exactly happened in this moment, because the term no-hitter hadn't been coined yet.
Well, we're going to stop on that and take a break. We've gone a bit over, and that is why your book is so terrific. We're talking about no-hitters before the term exists, and train robberies and major battles all in the same newspaper.
At the same time.
At the same time. So we'll be back.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Russ and Alan. We learn more here, have more fun here by accident than most places by design. And you know, I enjoy the program as I put it together and piece it together and make it all come together. But I also know that thousands of people just like you are also enjoying this program, and they even look forward to it. And here's what that is all about. That means that when Russell and Alan talk about the Dude Ranch Association and Golden Horseshoes and other organizations and products and services that would be good for you, those people listen, they pay attention, and they trust the source of good stories and good ideas. So here's my suggestion. As we go into the last half of the year 23, why don't you make some changes in your business and in your marketing ideas? You see, there are thousands of people who are Western-oriented, and they would like to know more about you and your products and your services. So if you'd like to, first of all, be a part of this fine program and get a little bit of the golden glory from that, we'd be glad to have a conversation and do an audition, and perhaps you can be a sponsor of this fine program from time to time, and also attract and talk to thousands of people who would probably be interested in what you are all about and what you have to offer. So just reach out to us at the Cowboy Up Podcast at gmail.com, the Cowboy Up Podcast at gmail.com. We really look forward to the opportunity to partner with you in this fine program. And now back to the program.
Well, let's pick a figure of that world, and I want you to talk a little bit about Bat Masterson.
Oh, Bat Masterson. Okay. He has an interesting story in there, too. I think one of the subtle storylines in the book is that Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson team up as lawmen for the first time in the summer of 1876. And that, of course, is in Dodge City. And this is a year of recovery and restart for Bat Masterson. At the beginning of the year, he was nearly killed in a small village in Texas. And even in the midst of his recovery, he fields a request from his buddy Wyatt Earp to come be a lawman in Dodge City, which is a town that knows that it is about to become the hub of Texas cattle drives, and it's about to be overrun by Texas cattle and Texas cowboys, and they're going to need to beef up the lawmen in town big time. So Wyatt Earp is one of the instrumental guys in assembling a new team of lawmen, and he brings in Bat Masterson and Bat's brother, Jim, I believe, and so it turns into a bit of an all-star team of lawmen in town. And it leads to the first season of, let's say, 3 years where Bat and Wyatt are teamed up for the most part in Dodge City as the peacekeepers. And it leads to all kinds of adventures and then tragedies down the road, which I didn't want to get too much into in this book because they happen later in time, 1877, 78, and 79. But this is really the beginning of the Big Bad Masterson legend.
Well, so that brings a question. So much happened at that period in time. Was there a guiding force, a guiding person that said, this is a huge time right here, and I'm going to assemble this cast, and they're going to take us forward, and, history is going to change right now? Was there somebody or some event that made that happen? Did people know that it was happening when it was happening?
To some extent, yeah. I think a little bit. Dodge City had an idea that it was about to become the next big cattle hub. As the railroad lines moved west across Kansas, each new stop became the next big cattle hub on the line. And it was essentially Dodge City's turn next by 1876. And they had already had a couple early cattle seasons in 1874 and 1875. Each one, 1875, was bigger than 74. And they could pretty clearly see, the city fathers could pretty clearly see that the summer of 1876 was going to take another jump. They were going to get a lot more cattle and a lot more cowboys, and the town was going to get a lot more rowdy. And they had not had great lawmen in the past, with I think the exception of one gentleman, but of course he died trying to serve a warrant. So their only really solid lawman was killed trying to serve a warrant, and the rest of them were not up to the task of working in a town that was about to experience what Dodge was about to experience. So the mayor really took active steps to go recruit new lawmen. And the way I read the history is that he gave some control then to a guy like Wyatt Earp. The mayor hired Wyatt Earp and said, I'm bringing you in to be the assistant marshal and to be one of the top guys. Now you go hire more team members.
And did Wyatt know the Masterson brothers from the buffalo killing fields?
Yeah, the story that seems to rise to the top is that Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp probably met during one of the final buffalo hunting seasons for both guys. There's no concrete evidence of it, but that, the hearsay and friends saying this and that, that's what's generally accepted, that they met during one of their buffalo hunting seasons and somehow stayed decent enough friends that Wyatt chose to hire Bat.
That's always been interesting to me. This was a period where all this was occurring. So a couple of years would happen and they'd have an event, kill a lot of buffalo or something. And then they'd go back east and they'd promote themselves and say, here, I'll talk to you. I'm the famous buffalo hunter, and come listen to me. And that kind of was an odd way to get famous, is promote yourself. And I think a lot of that, or some of that, went on.
100%. Yeah, and I think some of that traces itself back to at about the same time period when some of that was happening. 1872, 1873, Buffalo Bill Cody was starring in his stage play, the original version called Scouts of the Prairie, which he then transformed into Scouts of the Plains. So he was doing exactly that. He was in the East promoting a fictional version of real life, and that became so popular that others followed in his footsteps and promoted themselves in the same way.
So he'd be on stage for a while, and then he'd go back out in West and kill a few more buffalo kind of thing?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. He and Texas Jack Omohundro were famous for his Texas Jack even more than Buffalo Bill. Each summer season, Texas Jack would leave the stages of the East, go out to the West, and lead big hunting expeditions all through the Yellowstone area, in Wyoming and Montana. He and Cody both did this, just Cody to a slightly lesser extent, but they would lead famous dignitaries and really anyone who wanted to pay to be out in the wilds of the West for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. And they'd make a bunch of money, and then they'd come back east during the winter months and perform in the stages.
Well, the incredible Cody Museum in Cody, Wyoming, it has an analogy that I've just never forgotten. It said, think of Buffalo Bill as this, as an actor, if you compare him directly to John Wayne, as if he were in the movie about World War II as John Wayne would be, and then he would go back and fight in World War II and then come back and do another movie. And that's exactly what Alan was saying. He was also acting, as you know, as a scout for the Indians for the cavalry against the Indians, and won the Congressional Medal of Honor doing that. But he's a fascinating guy. I want to go back to Wyatt. We've mentioned him, and we have our presence down in Tombstone at Tombstone Monument Ranch. And I always love to ask everybody their view on Wyatt Earp, and some people, in my view, incorrectly take the side of the Cowboys. And if you want to start a fight, go down to Tombstone, start it, and sit down in one of the bars and say, I think this, and somebody will disagree with you, I guarantee you. But they're still battling that. But the Cowboys good, the Cowboys bad. How do you view Wyatt Earp and his brothers?
Man. Oh, I think that is what an enormous question. Oh, Lord.
You can simplify your answer.
Yeah.
I'll give you one. Our state historian, Marshall Trimble, asked him. He said, well, I always just answer it this way. Everybody the Cowboys shot got shot in the back, and everybody Wyatt shot was shot in the front.
That's a great way to phrase it. Yeah, I'll steal Marshall's answer then. That's a good one. I think I'll take it. But yeah, I think I agree. I think generally speaking, he was on the right side of the law, the good side of the law. He had a little trouble early in his life, it sounds like, and he certainly was not shy about trying to make money off of gambling whenever possible. But I think if you wanted to consider those things negatives, I think they're very, very minor in comparison to things like the cattle rustling ring and the theft and murder that the Cowboy Gang was known for. So I think it's pretty hard to put Wyatt on the wrong side of the ledger.
Maybe there wasn't a wrong side.
There was definitely much more gray area at that time, for sure. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I don't think it's that hard of a call.
Yeah, I don't think it's really that difficult.
How about Wild Bill? He's one of your characters.
Yeah, Wild Bill, he's an interesting one because he's very much at the end of his career in his life. So much of these other stories are about the beginnings. For instance, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson are really starting the beginning of the peak, the meat of their story. Wild Bill is at the very end of his. And what I found most interesting and during the research, which certainly other authors have written about this long before I did, but I just learned it and found it interesting, that he very much seemed to have the premonition that he was at the end of his life. He seemed to have these dark thoughts and dark suspicions that Deadwood was probably going to be his final stop on the line. And it was interesting that, to have a guy of that stature who was, again, I was trying to think of another analogy in there, but kind of like Custer was a bit of an American legend in his own time, partially because he promoted himself like crazy. But Wild Bill, who hated promotion, was probably a bigger legend in his own time than even Custer was. And to have this guy being just 39 years old and feeling like he's at the end of his life and pretty sure it's going to end in this one place, it's a very interesting idea.
Without promoting himself, what made him that level of legend in his own time?
Well, I think, maybe I should walk back a little bit. I mean, I think he sat down with a newspaper reporter, a magazine reporter, in the early 1870s, I believe it was, late 1860s, early 1870s, and told this guy a lot of stories about his life. And it sounds like he was kind of having a little bit of fun with the reporter and greatly embellishing these, and without really understanding that the reporter might take them as fact. Bill was just having a little bit of fun with it. He was mixing a lot of fact with a lot of fiction. And this guy went back east and wrote this huge article that made everybody fall in love with Wild Bill. And a lot of it was not necessarily true, but I think it was an embellishment of true things. Bill had been in a lot of gunfights and had been in a lot of scrapes by the early 1870s. So he had well earned his stripes. And then somewhat without thinking about it, he ended up promoting himself. And then he did a tour with Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack on stage, which he absolutely hated and quit eventually. So he did a little bit of self-promotion, but I think his story was much more about the deeds that he actually did rather than just simply doing a press tour a lot of times.
Interesting. Well, I think it's kind of an odd comparison, but I've read that Pancho Villa is so well known because he invited the press along as he went through his revolutionary, and that's why there's all the pictures and all the, and more than Zapata or other people probably of similar magnitude inviting the press. made him famous, and this story. And I bet that journalist didn't mind the embellishment, made a better newspaper story.
Oh yeah, embellishment was even more common then than it is now. It was a hallmark of what you would maybe loosely call journalism back then. But Custer was exactly the same as Pancho Villa, as you're describing him. He invited and wanted members of the press with him everywhere to chronicle everything. So that was a core part of every expedition he went on, was to have reporters there to catalog it all.
Well, before we wind up, Alan's favorite, Jesse James. How about him?
Yes. Well, another guy who loved the press and corresponded deeply with the press. Part of the reason we know so much, let's say more about Jesse James than a guy like Billy the Kid, was partially because Jesse James was so involved with the press. And so this year of 1876 is really, I found it really interesting because it is the peak and then the fall of the first era of Jesse James. And then he has a bit of a resurgence a few years later. But by 1876, he has been the premier outlaw of the land for 10 solid years, and has been corresponding with the press and has been on the run and has been chased, but has never really been threatened with being caught. And it's not until he and his gang get a little bit over their skis, to use the expression, when they go up to Minnesota, that things finally fall apart. And that really is the end of the first draft, the first serious outlaw gang of the Old West. The James Younger gang was the premier outlaw gang of the Old West for that first period, and 1876 ends up being the end of it.
And Jesse, how did he correspond with the press? How did he achieve that?
A couple different ways. Sometimes he directly just wrote letters to the editor. He loved to write letters to the editor and correspond directly with the newspapers.
He liked seeing his name in print.
Oh, loved it. And the famous incident that a lot of people would bring up who know the history is the press release that he wrote after one of his train robberies. He conducted a train robbery and had a pre-written press release that he gave to I believe the gentleman who they abducted, who ran the little train station. They gave him a press release so that he could give it to the newspapers after the robbery was done. And so he did little things like that. And he had there was a guy who was a big time newspaperman in Missouri, who worked for two different newspapers. And he idolized the Missouri guerrillas, from the Civil War era, of which Jesse James was the most prominent by the Old West era. And so that guy really turned Jesse James into a household name. He wrote tons and tons of columns about Jesse James and pitched this idea that Jesse James was more of a freedom fighter than just a simple bank robber or train robber. So there were a couple different ways in which Jesse James got his names out, three big ones in which his name became really widely known.
I love it. He hands the press release to the...
Yeah. We don't have anybody that colorful in today's world. I'd love to see somebody like that come along.
I tell you what, it'd be interesting to see if they could even rob a train. It'd be amazing. So it was just the way that those guys did things it was complex yet simple and effective, and they made it work, and they loved to promote themselves, or at least Jesse did. I should say that not all members of Jesse's gang were in love with the idea of self-promotion the way Jesse was.
Well, yeah, they say Gotti got himself killed by chasing press. He'd lived longer if he'd shut up. So maybe it's not always a good plan. Tell us about your podcast and what's next on it.
Legends of the Old West. This is where the whole book was born. It's now been around for 5 years, almost 6 years. We just did the story of another legend of the Old West. Kit Carson was our latest really big name series. So that's out there in the world, especially for people who like the history of the Southwest region. And next up, we actually are going to be we're doing immediately, depending on when this episode airs and when someone listens to it, we're doing stories of con artists of the Old West, some of the swindlers.
I can't wait.
Which is a fun departure from our norm. And then right after that, we're actually doing the story of Buffalo Bill Cody. So a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, we're gonna put in podcast form and do that. And we've got tons of other stuff on the horizon. We're gonna start getting into some larger stories that go deeper into American history that are maybe not technically in the Old West era, from roughly 1865 to 1900. That's generally considered the Old West period. but people who love that era also want to hear about the mountain men and, the early Texas history and the history of the Alamo and Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and all these kinds of stories. So we're going to start working in those stories down the road.
So where can a reader go to tune into that whole flow of information?
Well, the podcast is available on pretty much every podcast listening platform that you can find. The book is available from all major booksellers. It maybe the simplest way is to go to our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. And we have a link right there. And if you click on that link, you can have your choice of places to then go buy it. And part of the reason I highlight this is because if you go through that link, you can find a button to buy a signed copy of the book. We have done a deal with a local bookstore here in Phoenix. So if you want to support a local bookstore, an independent bookstore, you can buy a signed copy through them.
Perfect. And just, like our podcast, you're available on all the platforms, and it's Legends of the Old West. Is that, if I got it accurately?
That is correct. Yep. It's on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, all of them.
And of course, if people are listening to us, they probably, like Alan and I, are big fans of the West and its history. And this would be a great book to get started with because it sort of is a great platform and get people started along with all these big characters. I learned a lot today that Jesse James was a skilled media operator.
Yes.
So these are great things. So people can, and what a great St. Martin's Press first book, and obviously they recognized what a terrific premise your book is. So the summer of 1876, Chris Wimmer.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with the book, and I want to congratulate you on how you put it together and what it represents.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, guys. I think hopefully there will be a follow-up in the works. I have another idea that's very similar to this that I think can also work very well for the Old West history. So hopefully this is just part one of what essentially becomes a two-part thing.
Terrific.
And I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is Lynn Weezy Sneed. I'm a producer of the Cowboy Up podcast, and I'm at White Stallion with Mike, who is from Mississippi. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
How'd you get here from Mississippi? I mean, how'd you find the Dude Ranch?
Initially, some of my buddies and I were out staying at Tombstone Monument Ranch last year, and one of my friends from back home had been coming out to Tombstone for a number of years. And as we were leaving Tucson, he mentioned White Stallion Ranch and that he had never been here, but he said movies had been filmed there, shows and all. And so 2 years ago, I'd taken my grandson, Eli, he's here today, to Tombstone. He likes the Old West. And so we stayed at Tombstone Monument Ranch and visited Tombstone. And so we wanted to make a return trip and bring my son-in-law. And I said, we'll try White Stallion Ranch. And we'll stay here for 4 nights, and then we'll take 1 day trip to Tombstone, which we did yesterday. So that's how we wound up here. I researched, looked at their website, and I said, I think that would be great. I think my grandson would like it with not only the cowboy options as far as activities to do, but even the non-cowboy options, playing pool, playing chess, and so forth.
And I think there's been a few hours spent on the basketball court here.
And he loves the basketball court as well. You're exactly right. And, the swimming pool. So we just had a great time here, really have.
Oh, that's great. And maybe you'll come back?
Most definitely. I tell you, and I'm not just saying that, I would love to come back, especially around October or in March, because I've heard people that live locally say, the cactus are really blooming in March and all, and of course it'll be cooler in October, and how for Thanksgiving and Christmas it's all booked up already. So I'm definitely going to make a return trip. And even I talked to one of my buddies back home, in Mississippi, and he says, well, when we come back to Tombstone, we'll have to go out and stay a couple nights at White Stallion. So I've been building up to him. We truly have enjoyed it, and definitely we'll have a return trip.
Oh, that's great. Well, I hope to see you back here the next time.
I hope so as well. I've had a great time. Pleasure meeting you.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, I just think that the date of 1880 is a real pivotal date in our history, and so many things happened. The arrival of the railroad, the people in big numbers, and outlaws, and good and bad times in 1880. And it was just a sense that kind of stamped a period in time, and we went forward from there with a different life than we had before. So it was a real pivotal time in our history.
Definitely in the West. And I've always, I even tell our guests, the late 1870s to 1880 is when things really changed out here. And when you put the context of inaugural baseball season and Indian massacres all in the same summer of 1876, you just got to read the book. The summer of 1876 sets the stage for everything.
I'll concur and give you just a tiny story with it. My granddad settled in 1879 in the Duncan Valley. He brought in the first Jersey milk cow and planted the first fruit tree in the valley and built the first brick house in the valley there right in that time. And so history of my family just is big pivots right on that 1880.
Yeah, we drove through the Sierra Bonita Ranch, which is Henry Hooker's ranch, and that's where Wyatt Earp retreated to when the posse was chasing him, and Henry said, "You will not be taking Wyatt," and drove through that beautiful valley of that old land grant ranch, the Sierra Bonita, just last weekend. So it's all that period of time.
It's all around us if we care to look.
Well, history continues to fascinate, and so does Chris Wimmer's book, The Summer of 1876, a good read during any season. A cowboy shout-out to Stan Huston's production company for bringing this episode to you. Just discovered our podcast? Learn more about our team and connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by visiting our website, cowboyuppodcast.com. That's cowboyuppodcast.com. Until we meet again, this is Lynn Weezy Sneed reminding you to sit tall and ride safe.